Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Mike Lofgren, who has spent 28 years working in Congress, the last 16 as a senior analyst on the House and Senate budget committees. He is the author of the New York Times Bestseller, The Party is Over, How Republicans Went Crazy, Democrats Became Useless, and the Middle Class Got Shafted. And he has an article at Common Dreams, Vladimir Putin, the Authentic Leader of the Republican Party. Forget Trump, it was Putin who built the ideological template for the GOP. Welcome to Background Briefing, Mike Lofgren.
Good to be here under rather heavy circumstances, I would say.
Indeed. Well, we started off today's program with Time magazine reporter from Moscow who spent over 15 years in Russia and knows Zelensky and others, and it's a pretty grim picture, I must say. But for the longest time, it seemed like the Republican Party is becoming more and more like Putin's United Russia. And that's why I'm calling you, because I really relate to your article, Vladimir Putin, the Authentic Leader of the Republican Party. Forget Trump, it was Putin who built the ideological template for the GOP. And it seems to me it's quite possible that it's just going to get more and more obvious that Trump's GOP is more and more like Putin's party. And we don't know whether or not what percentage of the Republicans are actually going to support Biden. Normally, partisanship ends at the shores, as they say, but that's not true with this GOP. You've got Josh Hawley and that dimwit Ron Johnson from Wisconsin and others who are completely on Putin's side, and you've got Tucker Carlson parroting Russian propaganda on Fox every night. So what do you expect is going to happen? You would think that they'd be shamed by what is starting to happen with Putin essentially invading, just literally claiming another chunk of Ukraine and threatening the rest of it. And if there's a huge amount of death and destruction, which there might well be, you'd think that they'd be shamed into being heroes and toadies for this little tyrant. But I don't know. What do you expect? If it gets worse, are they going to turn around and keep telling us, like the guy that Peter Thiel is supporting in running for the Senate in Ohio, J.D. Vance, that we shouldn't be involved? You know, this is not our fight. Let's get out of Ukraine. What do you think?
Well, you know, not having the credentials of Nostradamus, I can't predict. What I can say that obviously Trump plays a role in this. He released some video, or it was released on YouTube, of him being interviewed by one of these right-wing shock jocks, in which he's praising Putin's invasion there of Donetsk and Luhansk as a genius move. So partly it is the dog-like loyalty to Trump among a huge percentage of Republicans, but this preceded Trump as well. You could see beginning 2012 or thereabouts, the beginning of this with religious fundamentalist types, the religious right, such as Franklin Graham, identifying with Putin's very reactionary politics that goes under the label of cultural conservatism, the sort of fake Christianity, the anti-gay stuff, and the misogyny. All that is very appealing to a large section of the base of the Republican Party. And they got their hooks into some of these groups. For instance, the NRA they cultivated, and they sent people to this country, you know, to contribute money and to schmooze their way into influential situations with the NRA. And, of course, they're basically an adjunct of the Republican Party. So this kind of thing is a kind of political, cultural thing that precedes Trump. Trump intensified it, of course, but it's just there. And when you add the natural knee-jerk reflex to oppose anything that Biden is doing, then it makes it at least a 50-50 proposition, I would say, that they do come around to not supporting not just the Biden administration, but all the democracies in Europe on this issue. Now, there's a division. Nobody wants to support Biden. Those who are sort of what's left over of the Cold War Republicans and the hawks, they'll sort of damn Biden with faint praise and vice versa and say, well, his weakness invited it. But that's kind of an incoherent position, given that these people basically kept their mouths shut for 4 years when Trump was groveling to Putin and trying to extort the country that we're trying to defend, Ukraine, for his own political purposes. So that's a very incoherent position. And the other side, the Tucker Carlsons, have at least a more straightforward, coherent position in the sense of being self-consistent.
Right.
They don't want any part of this because they identify with Putin.
Right. Well, you mentioned the religious right forming compacts with the Russians over family values, and Putin, of course, has an alliance with the reactionary Orthodox Church, and the support for Trump and the Republicans are in the red states, the rural states, and the urban states are very blue in this country. The same in Russia. Putin supports with the narod, with the country, and not in the cities, particularly amongst the young. And there are so many other comparisons. The most important one, of course, is that Putin and his political technologist Surkov came up with this idea of essentially bread and circuses distracting people, and that's exactly what the GOP today is. They don't have any policies, plans, programs. They just have trolling and stunts and culture wars and obstruction. So, Mike, given that Putin and Trump's GOP both stand for nothing except taking care of oligarchs, what else can you tell us in terms of similarities?
I think there's a similar thing going on between the base of the Republican Party and Putin's base in Russia in terms of they're both being demographic groups on the downgrade. If you look into the red states, those are the ones with the highest rate of COVID deaths. They have a very high rate of opioid deaths, the so-called deaths of despair that Angus Deaton, who is a demographer, referred to, suicide, alcohol, pills, just poor health outcomes generally, because these are places with very poor medical care. And the Republican Party isn't going to give it to them. That's the important thing to remember. They're hooked on all this culture war stuff. But it's the same in Russia. Russia has an extremely low life expectancy for the so-called developed world. In fact, it's lower than a good many third world countries. Their per capita income's less than the Maldives. Their life expectancy is about where Bangladesh is. It's very similar in extreme cases in the United States, like Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia. You have roughly the same life expectancy as people in Russia. So it's a similar demographic. They both distrust vaccines because the Republican Party here was spreading all kinds of disinformation about it. And because Putin made such a big propaganda campaign of undermining confidence in the Western vaccines like Pfizer and Moderna, that it backfired on him. And now there's a huge suspicion of vaccines in Russia, and of course their own vaccine, the Sputnik, is not very effective. You might as well take horse dewormer.
Right. Well, some of the other comparisons, though, that you make in your article between the GOP and Putin is in the way that Putin had this whole rant about his version of history about Russia and Ukraine, which was bizarre. And today, in his announcement, Biden sort of referred to it as being pretty off the wall. But there are similarities in the way that they've gone after their opposition in Russia with Navalny, etc., basically saying he poisoned himself. Well, the Republicans are claiming that the January the 6th insurrectionists were tourists or FBI provocateurs or Antifa. So there's a real similarity there. And Putin has rehabilitated Stalin, and they've shut down Memorial, the historical organization dedicated to revealing the horrors of Stalin. They've shut that down. And what are the Republicans doing? They're making it illegal in this country to even teach about slavery, for example. I mean,
correct.
They're redoing
as
history.
As Glenn Youngkin got inaugurated, of course, he ran as this kind of earnest suburban dad, and a lot of these feather-brained voters said, "Oh, he looks so good in fleece." Well, he turns around; he's just another Trump clone. And the first thing he does is try to prohibit localities, counties, from having their own rules about masking and vaccination and so forth, particularly in their schools. And now, as I grew up, I used to think that the Republicans were for subsidiarity, devolution, in other words, operate things at the lowest level of government, like the county, the municipality, and so forth, because those folks know better what's for them than a bunch of bureaucrats who are out of touch. Now, all of a sudden, Fairfax County in Virginia cannot do that. And they had a program that was up and running and working. All this was done purely as a stunt to troll.
And that's what the governor of Florida is all about, trolling, and the one in South Dakota, and they're all running for president.
Kristi Noem.
Yeah. So just in closing, though, we're running out of time here, Mike. Trump's obviously in trouble with his business empire collapsing around him. His own accountants abandon him because his books are completely fraudulent. So is it possible, though, that as Trump faces massive debt servicing and doesn't have the income anymore, and people are boycotting his businesses, he's already making a deal with the Saudis in terms of golf tournaments in the desert, and he's obviously going to be funded by Putin as long as he can. He's been funding, the Russians have been funding him, or the Soviets going back to 1987. He's been on their payroll. So isn't that possibly what's going to happen here as he goes bankrupt? The Russians, Putin, and the Saudis are going to find ways to get money to him, to keep him alive as a political candidate for 2024?
He'll go wherever the money is.
No, but what about them?
There's no question about that.
Right, but are they going to fund him, in other words? Because he's the gift that keeps on giving for Putin, and obviously the Saudis want him because he gives them a blank check.
In all likelihood, I think they would. Of course, we must also not forget now his documents from his administration. If even the Supreme Court has now ruled that he can't hang on to them, hopefully the mills of the gods are grinding very slowly, but hopefully they will eventually produce some results here.
Well, Mike Lofgren, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And again, I speak with Mike Lofgren, who spent 28 years working in Congress, the last 16 as a senior analyst on the House and Senate budget committees. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Party is Over, How Republicans Went Crazy, Democrats Became Useless, and the Middle Class Got Shafted. And he has an article at Common Dreams, Vladimir Putin, the Authentic Leader of the Republican Party.